King Philip II bashed open the doors to his son's bedchamber himself. He came not as a father, but as a general leading an invasion, clad from head to toe in battle armor. Prince Don Carlos, heir to the most powerful empire on earth, was jolted from his sleep to see his bedchamber filled with armed guards, and his own father standing at their head. The king's face was a mask of cold duty, his eyes unreadable behind his steel visor. In that chilling, heart-stopping moment, the prince understood. This wasn't a lecture. This wasn't a punishment. This was an arrest. The man who gave him life had come to take his freedom, and a king's duty was about to annihilate a father's love. This moment of familial betrayal would echo through the courts of Europe. But how did it come to this? To understand how a king could become the jailer of his only son and heir, we must return to the very beginning, to a royal birth that was seen as both a divine miracle and a terrible, hidden curse. Before we delve into our story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It is the surest way to join us for every future exploration into the forgotten corners of the past. Before Don Carlos ever took a breath, he was already a prisoner of his own blood. The year was 1545, and in the Spanish royal palace, courtiers whispered excitedly about the coming heir. But behind closed doors, the royal physicians exchanged worried glances. They understood something the celebrating nobles didn't. This child was the product of a bloodline so intertwined, so obsessively pure, that it had become poison. Here's what pure meant to the Hapsburgs. Carlos had 6 great-great-grandparents. Just 6. A normal person has 16. Think about that for a moment. 10 of his ancestors had been erased through generations of uncles marrying nieces, of first cousins wedding first cousins, all in the name of keeping the crown's blood untainted by outsiders. The family tree wasn't branching, it was strangling itself. The court scribes recorded his birth with flourishing quills and golden ink, but they couldn't record the invisible damage coded into his very cells. When Carlos finally emerged into the world on July 8, 1545, the midwives noticed his head seemed oddly shaped, his cries weaker than they should be. But he was alive, and he was male, and that was enough for celebration. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, held him exactly once. She was barely 17, exhausted from a brutal delivery that had torn her body apart from the inside. The fever set in within hours. While the court celebrated the birth of an heir, Maria's skin burned like parchment. She whispered prayers in Portuguese, her homeland's language, as her ladies-in-waiting pressed cold cloths to her forehead. 4 days, that's all she got. 4 days to be a mother before the infection claimed her. The same bells that had rung for Carlos's birth now tolled for Maria's funeral. The infant prince, swaddled in silk and ignorant of his loss, had cost his mother her life before he could even focus his eyes enough to see her face. And here's where it gets truly dark. Maria wasn't just Carlos's mother. She was also his first cousin. Their fathers were brothers. Their mothers were sisters. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a genetic echo chamber. The same blood that had killed Maria now flowed through Carlos, carrying with it generations of accumulated damage. King Philip, barely 20 years old himself, stood at his wife's funeral holding his infant son. The courtiers saw a grieving widower with his heir. But Philip saw something else in that moment. He saw the price of purity. His son had survived, yes, but at what cost? And more terrifying still, what invisible costs were yet to be paid? The wet nurses reported troubling things. The baby's feeding was erratic. His sleep patterns were chaotic. He would scream for hours without cause, then fall into deathly silent stupors that terrified the servants. One nurse swore she saw him stop breathing entirely for nearly a minute before gasping back to life like a drowning man breaking the surface. But infant troubles were common in royal nurseries. The court physicians assured Philip that the boy would grow strong. After all, he carried the blood of emperors, of conquistadors, who had claimed half the world for Spain. Surely that legacy would manifest in greatness. They had no idea how wrong they were. The blood of emperors was exactly the problem. Each generation of intermarriage had been like adding another link to an invisible chain, and Carlos was wearing all of them. The Hapsburg jaw, that famous deformity, was just the visible sign of deeper damage. What lurked beneath would be far worse. The curse wasn't mystical, it was mathematical. Genetic roulette played with increasingly terrible odds, and Carlos had lost that game before he ever had a chance to play. Every cell in his body carried the accumulated mistakes of his ancestors' pride, their obsession with keeping power within the family at any cost. He had survived his birth, a motherless prince born into a genetic cage, but the curse of his blood wasn't just a number in a family tree. Soon, it would become visible for the whole world to see, etched into his very bones. The royal armourer was sweating. The breastplate, forged from the finest Milanese steel, simply wouldn't fit. He'd measured the Prince of Asturias 3 times, each measurement more puzzling than the last. The left side of the prince's torso curved inward where it should expand. The right shoulder sat higher than the left by nearly 2 inches. No amount of hammering or reshaping could make standard armor work on this 13-year-old body that defied symmetry. Carlos stood there, arms outstretched, as the armourer struggled. The prince's breathing came in short, sharp bursts, not from exertion, but because his sunken chest couldn't fully expand. Every breath was a battle his malformed ribcage fought against his lungs. The court pretended not to notice, but Carlos heard their whispers echo off the stone walls. The physical evidence of his cursed bloodline was becoming impossible to hide. His skull had grown asymmetrically, bulging on one side like a melon left too long in the sun. Palace portraits required increasingly creative angles to disguise it. His left leg had stopped growing at the same rate as his right, forcing him to walk with an odd, lurching gait that clicked and scraped across the marble floors. But here's the thing about divine right. It assumes divine perfection. In 16th century Spain, the king's body was considered a reflection of God's favour. A strong, symmetrical heir proved heaven's blessing on the royal line. But what did Carlos's twisted form say about the Habsburgs? What did it say about Spain itself? The court physicians developed elaborate explanations. The prince's humours were unbalanced. His stars were misaligned at birth. Anything but the truth, that generations of Hapsburg inbreeding had finally produced its inevitable result. They prescribed treatments that sound like torture today: bleeding to balance his humours, mercury baths to straighten his spine, specially crafted iron boots to force his shorter leg to stretch. Carlos endured it all with a fury that made servants flee his presence. When the metal boots came off each night, you could hear his screams echoing through the palace corridors. Not just from pain, but from rage at his own body's betrayal. He was supposed to be perfect. He was supposed to be king. The royal tutors reported even more troubling signs. The prince's attention wandered constantly. He would fixate on strange details, the pattern of cracks in the ceiling, the sound of his own breathing, while ignoring vital lessons in statecraft. His speech came in rapid bursts or not at all. Some days he spoke with the eloquence expected of royalty. Other days he could barely form coherent sentences, his tongue seeming to trip over itself. And then there were the headaches. Crushing, world-ending headaches that sent him to his chambers for days at a time. The servants would hear him pounding his malformed skull against the stone walls, trying to drive out the pain through more pain. When he emerged, his eyes would be bloodshot, unfocused, like he was seeing through our world into some terrible other place. The marriage proposals started arriving when Carlos turned 14. Royal families across Europe sent portraits of their daughters, each seeking alliance with Spain's vast empire. But Philip delayed, deflected, made excuses. How could he send honest descriptions of his son to potential brides? How could he explain that the heir to the throne couldn't stand straight, couldn't breathe properly, couldn't even wear armor like a true Spanish prince? The foreign ambassadors who met Carlos sent coded messages back to their courts. The prince shows signs of weakness. They wrote carefully. His constitution appears delicate. They didn't dare write the truth, that the heir to the Spanish throne looked like something broken and reassembled wrong, like a porcelain doll shattered and glued back together by a blind craftsman. The servants had their own whispered theories. Some said the ghost of his mother haunted his twisted bones, punishment for the unnatural union that created him. Others claimed you could see the sins of his ancestors written in his flesh, each deformity a generation's worth of pride made manifest. But the deformities on the outside were nothing compared to the darkness taking root on the inside. A monstrous cruelty was growing in the young prince, and it was about to reveal itself in the most grotesque way imaginable. The royal shoemaker presented the boots, trembling. He had made a mistake, and he had no idea his punishment would be to cut them up and eat them. It started as an ordinary fitting in Carlos's chambers. The craftsman had laboured for weeks on these boots, specially designed to accommodate the prince's shorter leg. But when Carlos tried them on, the left boot pinched, just slightly, just enough to send him into a rage that transformed the elegant chamber into a theatre of humiliation. "Eat them," Carlos commanded, his voice eerily calm. The shoemaker laughed nervously, certain he'd misheard. But the prince's eyes, those bloodshot, unfocused eyes, held no humour. "Cut them into pieces, and eat them, now." The court watched in horrified silence as the shoemaker, tears streaming down his face, took his own crafting knife to the leather. The sound of cutting filled the room, slow, deliberate slices through material he'd spent weeks perfecting. Then came the worst sound, chewing. The forced, rhythmic crunch of a man eating his own livelihood while a 17-year-old prince watched with satisfaction. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. The palace kitchens told stories that made seasoned soldiers blanch. Carlos had developed a fascination with watching animals die. Not hunting, which was noble, not even butchering, which was necessary. He wanted to see suffering. He would order live rabbits brought to his chambers, then roast them alive over his fireplace, timing how long their screams lasted. The servants tasked with cleaning his rooms would find the charred remains arranged in careful patterns, like some grotesque art. One young page made the mistake of laughing at the prince's limp. Carlos heard it. He always heard the mockery, real or imagined. That night, the boy woke to find the prince standing over his bed with a poker from the fireplace, glowing orange in the darkness. The only thing that saved him was Carlos's own malformed body betraying him. He swung the poker but lost his balance, giving the page time to flee, screaming into the corridor. The violence was becoming harder to contain. During a meeting with Portuguese dignitaries, Carlos suddenly grabbed a knife from the dinner table and held it to an ambassador's throat, demanding he admit that Portugal was inferior to Spain. The man's careful diplomatic training crumbled as he felt the blade press against his skin, saw the wild excitement in the prince's eyes. King Philip had to personally intervene, gently talking his son into lowering the weapon, like one might coax a rabid dog. But what terrified the court most wasn't the violence itself, it was the intelligence behind it. Carlos wasn't simply mad, he was cunning in his cruelty. He knew exactly who he could torment without consequence. He targeted servants, craftsmen, anyone without the political power to resist. When high-ranking nobles were present, he could play the part of a troubled but manageable prince. The moment they left, the mask dropped. The court physicians offered their explanations. The prince's unbalanced humours caused excessive choler. His deformed skull put pressure on his brain, creating violent impulses. But privately, even they wondered if something darker was at work. Was this madness born from his physical condition, or was it something else? A fundamental evil that would have existed even in a perfect body. His father, Philip, tried everything. Priests were brought in to pray over Carlos. The finest minds in Europe were consulted. Elaborate routines were established to manage the prince's worst impulses. But nothing worked. If anything, the attempts to control him only made him more creative in his cruelty. The servants developed an elaborate warning system. When Carlos's footsteps echoed through the corridors, that distinctive lurching gate word spread like wildfire. Chambermaid would abandon their duties. Kitchen boys would hide in pantries. Even the guards would find urgent business elsewhere. The heir to the throne had become a monster everyone fled from. A prince, this unstable, was a threat, but he could be managed, contained. That is, until his own father delivered a psychological blow so personal, so deeply humiliating, it would ignite Carlos's rage into an inferno. Every man in the Spanish court looked at the new queen, Elizabeth of Valois, with admiration. But Prince Carlos looked at her with something else, the burning resentment of a man looking at what was stolen from him. The betrayal had been a masterpiece of political maneuvering. Originally, Elizabeth had been promised to Carlos as part of a peace treaty between Spain and France. For months, the young prince had pored over her portrait, memorizing every detail of the beautiful French princess who would be his wife. For the first time in his twisted life, something pure had been offered to him, something that would be his alone. But Philip had other plans. The king was recently widowed, and Spain needed a queen more than it needed a future princess. In a stunning reversal that shocked European courts, Philip married Elizabeth himself. The father took what had been promised to the son, and he did it with the cold calculation of a chess master claiming a queen. The wedding day was torture refined to art. Carlos was required to attend, to stand there in his specially crafted clothes that hid his deformities, and watch his father marry his intended bride. Elizabeth was radiant, young, graceful, everything Carlos could never be. When she spoke her vows to Philip, Carlos heard them as theft. Every word she spoke to his father had been meant for him. Here's the cruelest part. Elizabeth was kind to him. She treated Carlos with genuine warmth, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of guilt. She called him dear cousin and included him in court activities. But her kindness was acid on an open wound. Every smile she gave him was a reminder of what he'd lost. Every moment of gentleness highlighted what he would never have. The court watched this psychological torture play out daily. At state dinners, Carlos sat at the high table, forced to watch his father and Elizabeth together. The way Philip's hand rested possessively on hers. The quiet conversations they shared in French, a language Carlos struggled with due to his speech difficulties. The looks between them that spoke of the marriage bed, the bed that should have been his. Carlos's obsession grew like a cancer. He would station himself where he could watch Elizabeth's daily routines. When she walked in the gardens, he followed at a distance, his uneven gait making stealth impossible. The sound of his dragging foot on gravel became a joke among the courtiers. You always knew when the prince was stalking the queen. He began leaving her gifts. Not normal courting gifts, but strange, unsettling offerings. Dead birds arranged in patterns outside her chambers. Locks of his own hair braided into intricate designs. Once, horrifyingly, he left a portrait of her that he had meticulously defaced, scratching out his father's figure wherever it appeared, and crudely drawing himself in Philip's place. Elizabeth, to her credit, handled it with grace. She never complained publicly, never gave Carlos the reaction he craved. But her ladies-in-waiting reported that she had started locking her chambers at night, that she would check over her shoulder when walking alone. The French princess, who had arrived so confident now, moved through the palace like prey. The breaking point came at a court masque. Carlos, emboldened by wine and the anonymity of his mask, approached Elizabeth during a dance. The court musicians played while he whispered something in her ear, something that made her face go white beneath her own mask. She excused herself immediately, and Philip's eyes followed his son with a look that could freeze blood. No one knows exactly what Carlos said that night, but from that moment, Elizabeth was never alone with him again. Guards were discreetly positioned whenever the prince might encounter the queen. Their interactions were limited to public ceremonies where dozens of eyes could monitor every word, every gesture. Carlos's humiliation curdled into something darker than simple resentment. He began telling anyone who would listen that his father had stolen his life, his future, his very purpose. The rambling grew more violent, more specific. He spoke of revenge, of justice, of taking back what was his by right. His mind, already a tinderbox of resentment and paranoia, was now primed for an explosion. It would only take one small physical shock to set it off, and it came in the form of a simple staircase. In 1562, Don Carlos chased a servant girl down a stone staircase. He never caught her. Instead, his flawed body betrayed him, and he fell. The girl's crime had been simple. She'd glimpsed him without his specially crafted shoes, seen his twisted foot in all its naked deformity. Her involuntary gasp of shock had triggered his rage. She fled down the narrow service stairs, while Carlos pursued, his uneven gait turning murderous intent into fatal clumsiness. His stronger leg overcompensated for the weaker one. His malformed skull threw off his balance. Witnesses said he seemed to hang in the air for a moment, arms windmilling frantically before gravity claimed him. The sound of his head striking stone echoed through the palace like a bell tolling doom. Then silence. For 3 days, Carlos lay unconscious. His skull had fractured, the already misshapen bone now cracked like an egg. Fluid leaked from his ears. His breathing came in rattling gasps that sounded like death approaching. Philip summoned every physician in Spain, offering fortunes for anyone who could save his heir. The doctors tried everything their medieval science could conceive. They bled him until his sheets were soaked crimson. They applied poultices of ground beetles and mercury. They prayed over him in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Nothing worked. The prince's fever climbed until his skin felt like parchment about to ignite. Then came Dr. Pintorite with his radical solution. Trepanation. Drill through the skull to release the evil humors trapped inside. It was a procedure that killed more often than it cured, but Carlos was dying anyway. Philip, desperate, gave his consent. The surgery took place at midnight. The physicians believed the moon's position would aid healing. They cleared Carlos's chamber of everyone except the medical team and 2 strong men to hold the prince still if he woke during the procedure. The sound of the drill biting into bone carried through the palace walls. Servants later swore they heard it in their nightmares for years, that grinding, scraping penetration of skull. Here's the truly horrifying part. Carlos did wake. Halfway through the procedure, his eyes snapped open. The physicians later recorded that he didn't scream. He just stared at the ceiling, fully conscious as they drilled into his head, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or curse. The strong men had to pin his arms as his body convulsed, fighting against the restraints while the surgeon continued his terrible work. When the skull finally gave way, the release of pressure was audible, a wet, sucking sound as trapped blood and fluid escaped. The surgeon inserted a silver tube to keep the hole open, to let the poison drain. For 2 weeks, Carlos lay there with a hole in his head, drifting between consciousness and delirium. In his fever dreams, he raved about Elizabeth, about his father, about conspiracies that might have been real or imagined. He spoke to people who weren't there, held conversations with his dead mother in Portuguese he'd never learned. The physicians took notes, trying to separate fever talk from confession. Then, miraculously, the fever broke. Carlos's eyes cleared. He recognized faces, spoke coherently, even managed to eat solid food. The court rejoiced. The heir had been saved. God had shown mercy on the Spanish throne. But something fundamental had changed. The Carlos who woke from that procedure was not the same one who had fallen. The physical trauma had rearranged something in his already damaged brain. Where before there had been cruelty tempered by cunning, now there was just raw, unfiltered madness. He became convinced that everyone was plotting against him. He would test his food for poison, making servants taste everything first. He slept with weapons under his pillow. He began keeping names of people he believed were enemies, complete with detailed plans for their punishment when he became king. Most terrifying of all, he started talking openly about his father, not with the previous resentment over Elizabeth, but with something colder, more calculated. He would ask foreign ambassadors hypothetical questions. What would happen if a prince needed to remove an unfit king? How had other nations handled succession when the current monarch had lost God's favor? The thing that rose from that sickbed was no longer just a cruel boy or a spurned lover. It was a paranoid, raving creature who was now openly talking about killing his own father, and King Philip was listening. King Philip sat in his cavernous, dark study, a letter in his hand. It was a report from a spy, and it confirmed his greatest fear. His son, the heir to the throne, was planning treason. The letter detailed Carlos's recent meeting with Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother. The prince had proposed fleeing to the Netherlands, where Spanish rule was already threatened by revolt. He would present himself as an alternative to his father, a liberator who would grant the freedoms Philip denied. The Spanish Empire's enemies would rally to him. Civil war would follow. Philip set the letter down with hands that barely trembled. Around him, the walls were lined with maps of his vast empire territories, stretching from the Americas to the Philippines, all held together by the iron will of the Spanish crown. One mad prince could shatter it all. But this wasn't just about empire. This was about a father's love colliding with a king's duty. Philip had tried everything to save Carlos. He'd forgiven the violence, overlooked the threats, attributed every outrage to illness rather than evil. Even now, part of him wanted to burn the letter, to pretend he'd never read it. The king called for more reports. They painted an increasingly damning picture. Carlos had been hoarding weapons in his chambers. He'd tried to bribe guards for information about palace security. Most damning of all, he'd sent encrypted letters to known enemies of Spain, testing their willingness to support a coup. Here's what made Philip's choice truly agonizing. He understood his son's rage. He knew he had failed Carlos as a father. The boy's deformities, his madness, even his cruelty, they all stemmed from choices Philip's ancestors had made, bloodlines Philip had continued. Every twisted bone in Carlos's body was a monument to Hapsburg pride. Philip began his countermeasures with heartbreaking subtlety. He assigned new servants to Carlos' loyal men, who reported every word. He had the prince's weapons quietly removed during cleaning, hoping Carlos wouldn't notice. He even tried one last time to reach his son, inviting him for long walks where he spoke of legacy, of duty, of the weight of crowns. Carlos responded with escalating paranoia. He accused his father of poisoning him, of stealing his birthright, of being a tyrant who had lost heaven's mandate. During one dinner, he stood and declared before the entire court that Philip was unfit to rule, that Spain needed young blood, not an old man's fearful grip. The silence that followed was deafening. The international situation made delay impossible. Philip's spies reported that foreign courts were watching, waiting. If Carlos fled Spain, if he presented himself as a wronged prince seeking justice, he would find support. The French would use him against Spain. The Protestants in the Netherlands would rally to him. The carefully balanced European order would collapse into war. Philip began writing letters, dozens of them, to every major court in Europe. Not orders or threats, but careful explanations. He described Carlos's illness in vague but damning terms. He spoke of a father's burden, a king's terrible duty. He was preparing the ground, ensuring that when he acted, the world would understand. The final straw came in January 1568. Carlos had gathered his most trusted servants and revealed his plan to flee within days. He would escape to Italy first, then make his way to the Netherlands. He had promises of safe passage, offers of support. In his madness, he truly believed he could return at the head of an army and claim what was his. One of those trusted servants was Philip's spy. Within hours, the king knew everything. That night, Philip made his choice. He called for his armor, not ceremonial dress, but true battle armor. His counselors were puzzled. There was no enemy at the gates, no rebellion to crush. But Philip knew better. The enemy was within. The enemy was his blood, his failure, his son. As he fastened each piece of steel, Philip transformed himself. The father died with each buckle fastened. What remained was the King of Spain, defender of the faith, protector of an empire that could not fall to madness. The choice was made, duty over blood, kingdom over son. On the night of January 18th, 1568, King Philip II called for his armor, not to ride into battle, but to walk down a silent palace hallway and confront his own child. A physician leaned close to the prison door and heard the prince mumbling. He said, "I am rotting, and they are letting me rot." 6 months had passed since the arrest. Carlos had been moved to a tower room, technically comfortable, with furnishings befitting a prince, but a prison nonetheless. The windows were barred. The door locked from outside, and slowly, methodically, the heir to the Spanish throne was decomposing while still alive. The physical decline was horrifying. Without exercise, Carlos's already weak body began to atrophy. His shorter leg, no longer forced to bear weight, withered further. Bedsores appeared where his twisted spine pressed against the mattress. But the truly devastating decay was mental, the isolation feeding his paranoia until reality itself became negotiable. He would hold conversations with invisible visitors. Servants bringing food reported that he would set places for people who weren't there. His dead mother, previous Spanish kings, sometimes even different versions of himself. He would rage at these phantoms, plead with them, conduct entire council meetings with empty air. The smell became unbearable. Carlos refused to bathe, convinced the water was poisoned. His chamber pot went unemptied for days because he believed servants were stealing his waste for dark magic. Sores on his scalp, perhaps from his old head injury, perhaps from neglect, wept constantly. The stench of decay preceded any visitor by yards. But here's the most terrifying part. Philip knew. The king received daily reports on his son's condition. He read about the festering sores, the raving conversations with ghosts, the gradual transformation of a prince into something barely human, and he did nothing. No physicians were sent. No treatments authorized. Carlos was being allowed to rot just as he claimed. The prince's lucid moments were perhaps worse than his madness. He would suddenly realize where he was, what was happening to him. In those moments, he would write frantic letters to his father, alternating between begging for forgiveness and spewing threats. Philip kept every letter but never responded. The silence was more cruel than any torture. By July, Carlos could barely walk. His muscles had wasted away. His skin hung loose on his malformed bones like ill-fitting cloth. Servants reported that he would drag himself across the floor rather than ask for help, leaving trails of blood from the sores on his knees. His pride, even in madness, wouldn't let him show weakness. He developed an obsession with ice. In the sweltering Spanish summer, he demanded bucket after bucket of ice water. He would drink enormous quantities, then pour the rest over his fevered head. The physicians who weren't allowed to treat him speculated he was trying to cool the fire in his brain, to freeze out the madness that consumed him. On July 24, 1568, a servant found him unconscious in a pool of ice water. His lips were blue, his breathing barely visible. They carried him to his bed. He weighed so little by then that one man could lift him alone. For hours, he drifted between life and death, mumbling in languages he'd never spoken, calling for people long dead. Then, with stunning clarity, he opened his eyes and spoke his last coherent words. "Tell my father I forgive him." Whether this was genuine forgiveness or the cruelest possible revenge, forcing Philip to live with that mercy, no one could say. Hours later, Don Carlos of Spain died. He was 23 years old. The official cause was listed as natural illness. No mention of the imprisonment, no acknowledgement of the months of decay. The prince had simply fallen ill and died, as sometimes happened. The elaborate fiction began before his body was even cold. Within hours of his death, servants appeared with very specific orders. Every portrait of Carlos was removed from palace walls. His personal belongings were gathered and burned. Letters mentioning him were collected and destroyed. Scribes worked through the night, carefully editing court records to minimize his presence. The heir to the Spanish throne was being erased from history, while his corpse was still warm. His body was failing, his mind was gone, and his father was ignoring it all. Carlos was about to die, but death, it turns out, would not be his final humiliation. The crown's final act of violence against him would be an act of total silence. We return now to that cold January night, but now you understand the weight of every footstep, every breath in that room. When Philip stood in that doorway in full armor, he wasn't just arresting a rebellious son, he was ending a tragedy that had been written in blood and bone from the very beginning. The arrest itself was swift, clinical. Carlos didn't resist. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he recognized the futility. As the guards bound his hands, he looked at his father one last time. Some witnesses claimed he smiled. Others said he wept. The truth died with him in that tower room 6 months later. But the true violence came after his death. Philip's scribes worked with the efficiency of an inquisition, but their target wasn't heresy, it was memory itself. Within weeks, it was as if Don Carlos had never existed. Ambassadors who inquired about the prince were met with blank stares. Court records skipped from 1544 to 1569, as if the years of his life were just empty space. The funeral was a masterpiece of erasure. No grand ceremony, no lying in state. Carlos was buried quickly, quietly, with only the minimum ritual required for a prince. His tomb bore no inscription beyond his name and dates. Even in death, he was given just enough acknowledgement to avoid scandal, but not enough to be remembered. Philip ordered all correspondence about Carlos burned. Portraits were not just removed but destroyed, the canvases cut up and used for kindling. Servants who had attended the prince were reassigned to distant posts, or pensioned off with strict orders never to speak of their service. The tower room where he died was sealed and left to gather dust. The official histories written during Philip's reign skip over Carlos entirely or mention him in passing as a sickly prince who died young. No mention of the arrest, the imprisonment, the terrible decay. Certainly no acknowledgement of a father's role in his son's destruction. Philip had committed the perfect murder, not of a body, but of a story. But you cannot kill a story, not truly. 2 centuries later, the forgotten prince began to resurface, not in Spanish histories, still carefully controlled, but in the writings of Spain's enemies. Friedrich Schiller, the German playwright, discovered fragments of Carlos's tale and saw not a mad prince, but a romantic hero crushed by tyranny. His play Don Carlos transformed the twisted, cruel prince into a symbol of youthful idealism, destroyed by authoritarian age. Giuseppe Verdi took Schiller's fiction and set it to music. In his opera, Carlos becomes a tragic lover, noble and doomed. The monster, who made shoemakers eat leather, who roasted rabbits alive, who planned patricide, all of that vanished. In its place stood a romantic martyr, a victim of political necessity and cruel fate. The irony is perfect. Philip won every battle. He preserved his empire, controlled the narrative, erased his shameful son from history. But in doing so, he created a vacuum that artists filled with their own versions. The real Carlos, twisted in body and mind, was forgotten. The fictional Carlos, beautiful and tragic, became immortal. Even now, in opera houses across the world, audiences weep as tenor voices soar through Verdi's arias. They mourn a prince who never existed, while the real Don Carlos, the child king eaten from the inside by his own poisoned blood, remains truly forgotten. King Philip won the battle for the throne. He silenced his son and erased his name. But in the end, the story of Don Carlos, the child king eaten from the inside, refused to be forgotten. And it is a story that is still being told, even now.